Sometimes the most powerful person in the world feels like the loneliest. On the sacred night of the Winter Solstice, Emperor Cassian walked through his capital's back streets dressed as a common man. He wanted to see his kingdom through the eyes of those he ruled. What he found changed everything. A small girl, barely 6 years old, was digging through trash looking for food. Her tiny hands shook from the cold as she held a piece of stale bread. When he asked her name, she said Liora, and told him something that made his heart stop. Her mother had once worked in his palace. This wasn't just any hungry child. This was the daughter of someone he had failed to protect. But could one man's guilt become a kingdom's redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The imperial seal ring felt heavier on Emperor Cassian's finger than it had in years past. The ancient gold band, carved with the dragon crest of his bloodline, had been worn smooth by 30 winters of rule. Yet tonight it seemed to bite into his flesh with the weight of accumulated responsibility. He twisted it absently as he stood at the towering windows of his private chamber, gazing out over the frost-kissed capital that sprawled beneath the palace walls like a sleeping giant wrapped in winter's embrace. The city of Valenhall had grown magnificent under his reign. Cobblestone streets that gleamed like silver, ribbons in the moonlight, merchant quarters bustling even in the deep cold, and the great cathedral spire that pierced the night sky like a prayer made stone. Yet for all its beauty, the capital felt distant to him now, as remote as the stars that watched over his restless nights. When had he last walked among his people not as their emperor, but simply as a man seeking to understand the hearts that beat within his realm? The palace itself stood as testament to centuries of imperial power, soaring marble columns that supported vaulted ceilings painted with the deeds of his ancestors, tapestries that depicted the glory of battles won and territories claimed, floors of polished granite that reflected the warm glow of countless oil lamps. Every surface spoke of grandeur, every corner whispered of authority, yet Cassian found himself longing for something simpler, something real that all the splendor could not provide. Chancellor Marius knocked softly at the chamber door, his familiar rhythm announcing his presence as surely as any herald. The elderly statesman had served 3 emperors, his silver hair and lined face marking decades of faithful counsel. His robes of deep blue velvet rustled as he entered, carrying the weight of another day's petitions and concerns. "Your Majesty," Marius began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of court protocol, "the evening reports await your review. The harvest tallies from the eastern provinces, correspondence from allied kingdoms, and the treasury assessments you requested." Cassian nodded but did not turn from the window. "Tell me, old friend, when did you last venture beyond these walls without ceremony or guard? When did you last speak with a farmer about his crops, or a merchant about her trade, not as chancellor, but as a man curious about their daily struggles?" The question seemed to catch Marius off guard. He paused, considering carefully before responding. "I confess, Your Majesty, that duty has kept me bound to these halls for longer than I care to admit. The realm's business grows more complex each year, requiring constant attention to detail and protocol." "Protocol," Cassian repeated softly, his breath fogging the cold glass. "We govern through protocols and procedures, through reports written by scribes who summarize the observations of officials who rarely leave their offices. How can we truly serve people we never see, never speak with, never truly know?" The capital stretched before him in the moonlight, and Cassian could almost feel the pulse of life within those distant buildings. Families gathering around modest hearths, children sleeping in beds both comfortable and humble, adults sharing the burdens and joys that made up the fabric of ordinary existence. These were his people, yet they felt as distant as figures in a painting. Beautiful but untouchable, Captain Helena's measured footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, her evening patrol bringing her past the Emperor's quarters as it had for 7 years since her appointment to the palace guard. Unlike many of the court nobles who had inherited their positions through bloodline or political connection, Helena had earned her rank through merit and unwavering dedication. Her practical approach to duty had caught Cassian's attention years ago when she had quietly reorganized the guard rotations to better protect the palace while reducing the burden on individual soldiers. She appeared in the doorway, her weathered leather armor speaking of actual service rather than ceremonial display. Her brown hair, streaked with early grey despite her 35 years, was pulled back in the simple style favored by working soldiers. There was something reassuring about Helena's presence, a groundedness that reminded Cassian that not everyone in the palace had lost touch with practical concerns. "Your Majesty," she said with a respectful nod. "The evening watch reports all is secure. The city gates are manned, the wall sentries are at their posts, and the palace grounds show no signs of unusual activity." "Thank you, Captain," Cassian replied, finally turning from the window. "Tell me, what do you observe when you walk the palace grounds? What do you see beyond the security concerns?" Helena's eyes showed a flicker of interest at the unexpected question. "I see servants working long hours for modest pay, yet taking pride in maintaining the beauty of these halls. I see guards who speak fondly of families back home, sending most of their wages to support parents or siblings. I see a palace that functions because of hundreds of people whose names are rarely spoken in the court chambers, yet whose daily efforts keep this realm running smoothly." Her words stirred something in Cassian's chest, a recognition of truth that had been obscured by years of formal audiences and carefully prepared briefings. The real business of the kingdom happened in kitchens and guardrooms, in stables and gardens, among people whose lives were measured not in political victories or territorial gains, but in small acts of service and quiet dedication. "And beyond the palace walls," he pressed gently, "what do your duties show you of the city itself?" "The same dedication, Your Majesty, but with greater struggle," Helena replied honestly. "Families working hard to provide for their children, merchants striving to build honest trades, craftsmen taking pride in their skills. But also," she hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Speak freely, Captain. I value your observations. There are also those who struggle more than they should. Widows left without support when their husbands died in service to the crown. Children orphaned by the plague years who have found no place in our care. Good people who have fallen on hard times and found our institutions slow to respond to their needs. The plague years, even now. 5 years later, the memory cast a shadow over any discussion of the kingdom's challenges. The sweeping sickness had claimed nearly a third of the capital's population before the palace physicians had found ways to slow its spread. Among the dead had been Cassian's beloved wife, Empress Lydia, whose gentle heart and practical wisdom had balanced his more formal approach to rule. Lydia had possessed an instinct for the human cost of imperial decisions. She had insisted on visiting hospitals during the plague, had known the names of palace servants and their children, had maintained correspondence with families of soldiers who died in border conflicts. Her death had taken not only Cassian's personal happiness, but also his most trusted guide to the needs of ordinary people. The Empress would have known how to address those struggles, Cassian murmured, more to himself than to his companions. She had a gift for seeing past the abstractions of governance to the real people affected by our choices. Marius cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest, perhaps what you seek could be addressed through existing channels. We could commission more detailed reports from district administrators, or arrange for formal audiences with representatives from various trades and social groups." But Cassian was already shaking his head. "More reports, more formal procedures. We would still be separated by layers of protocol and preparation. People cannot speak freely to an emperor in formal audience. They say what they think he wants to hear, or what their advocates have coached them to say." The idea that had been forming in his mind throughout the evening was beginning to take clearer shape. For months, he had felt the growing distance between himself and his people, the sense that he was governing through abstractions rather than understanding. Perhaps it was time to bridge that gap in a more direct way. "I believe I shall take a walk this evening," he said finally, moving away from the window and toward the wardrobe where his simpler clothes were kept. Both Marius and Helena reacted with immediate concern. "Your Majesty," the Chancellor began, "without proper security arrangements, I do not intend to announce myself," Cassian interrupted gently. "I shall dress as an ordinary citizen and simply observe. No ceremony, no guard, no indication of my identity. Just a man walking through his city to understand what his people truly face." Helena stepped forward, her protective instincts clearly aroused. "Sire, even without announcement, there are risks. The city has its share of cutthroats and thieves, particularly in the darker quarters. And if your identity was somehow discovered, then I would learn something valuable about my people's true feelings toward their ruler," Cassian replied with a slight smile. "Captain, I do not make this decision lightly, but I have spent 30 years receiving information about my kingdom through intermediaries. Perhaps it is time I gathered some first-hand knowledge." He selected a simple brown cloak, woolen and well-made but without ornamentation, and a plain tunic that would mark him as neither wealthy nor desperately poor. The transformation was remarkable. Without his formal robes and the trappings of office, he looked like any prosperous merchant or skilled craftsman, someone who might own a small shop or workshop in the merchant quarter. Marius made one final attempt at dissuasion. "Your Majesty, if you are determined on this course, could we not arrange for discreet guards to follow at a distance? Men who could ensure your safety without interfering with your observations." Cassian considered this compromise carefully. There was wisdom in Marius's concern. An emperor had responsibilities that extended beyond his personal curiosity. Yet he also sensed that any security presence, however discreet, would alter the experience he sought. "I will carry a blade," he said finally, indicating a simple but well-forged dagger that had served him in his younger days. "And I will avoid the most dangerous quarters of the city. My goal is understanding, not reckless adventure. But I must do this alone, or not at all." Helena nodded reluctantly, recognizing the determination in his voice. "Then at least inform me of your planned route, so that if you do not return by dawn, we will know where to begin searching. The merchant quarter first. I think then perhaps the artisan districts near the river. I want to see how families live, how they struggle, how they find joy despite their challenges." He paused, struck by a sudden thought. "It is the Winter Solstice, a sacred time when the barriers between high and low traditionally soften. Perhaps it is fitting that an emperor should remember what it means to walk among his people as an equal." As he prepared to leave, Cassian felt the weight of the imperial seal ring on his finger. For a moment, he considered removing it, but decided instead to turn it inward so that the crest would not be visible to casual observation. Even in seeking to understand his people better, he could not entirely escape the responsibilities that defined his life. The night air was crisp and clean as he stepped through a side entrance of the palace, one used primarily by servants and minor officials. For the first time in years, he walked through his capital without the familiar weight of ceremony and expectation. He was simply a man, curious about the world around him, ready to discover what truths the night might reveal. The worn copper locket lay hidden beneath layers of refuse, its tarnished surface catching brief glints of torchlight as small hands pushed aside scraps of cloth and broken pottery. Cassian had been walking the narrow alleys behind the merchant quarter for nearly an hour, observing the quiet rhythms of evening life. Families sharing modest suppers visible through glowing windows, children playing simple games in doorways, the comfortable sounds of ordinary people settling into rest after honest labor. But this alley was different, darker. Here, the comfortable glow of hearth fires gave way to shadows punctuated only by the occasional torch mounted on crumbling walls. The cobblestones were uneven, cracked by years of neglect, and the buildings pressed close together as if seeking mutual support against the weight of accumulated hardship. It was there, in a pool of flickering orange light cast by a struggling torch, that he first saw her. The child could not have been more than 6 years old, her slight frame made even smaller by the oversized coat that hung on her shoulders like borrowed armor. Her dark hair, matted and unkempt, fell across a face that bore the gaunt marks of persistent hunger. But it was her hands that caught Cassian's attention, tiny fingers red with cold, methodically searching through the refuse with a determination that spoke of desperate necessity. She held something precious, a crust of bread, stale and hard, but clutched against her chest as if it were finest gold. Her movements were careful, practiced. This was not the first time she had been forced to search for sustenance in such places. Cassian felt his heart constrict with a pain he had not experienced since Lydia's death. All his theoretical understanding of poverty, all the reports and statistics and administrative discussions about social needs, crystallized in this single moment into something viscerally real. This was not a policy problem or a budget consideration. This was a child, hungry and alone, reduced to scavenging for survival in the shadow of his palace walls. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. His footsteps on the cobblestones caused her to look up, and for a moment their eyes met across the narrow alley. Hers were brown, large in her thin face, and filled with a wariness that should never have existed in someone so young. "Child," he said softly, his voice gentle despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "What are you doing out here alone on such a cold night?" She straightened, clutching the bread crust more tightly, ready to flee if necessary. "Looking for food," she said simply, with the matter-of-fact honesty of youth. "Sometimes the bakers throw away bread that's gone too hard to sell, but it's still good enough to eat if you soak it in water." The practical wisdom in her words hit Cassian like a physical blow. Here was a child who had learned survival strategies that no child should need to know, who had developed expertise in scavenging that spoke of months or years of necessity. "Are you alone?" he asked, kneeling to bring himself closer to her level. "Where is your family?" "My mother died in the plague time," she replied, her voice steady but small. "I've been taking care of myself since then. Sometimes other people help, but mostly they have their own troubles. The plague time. Even this child had been touched by the great sickness that had devastated the kingdom 5 years ago." Cassian felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. Guilt for the lives he had failed to save, for the suffering he had been unable to prevent, for the children like this one who had been left orphaned and forgotten in the aftermath. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Liora," she whispered, and then, as if the question required reciprocation, "What's yours?" For a moment, Cassian hesitated. To give his true name would change everything about this encounter, would transform it from a genuine meeting between human beings into something formal and constrained. But neither could he lie to this child who had shown him such honest trust. "My name is Cassian," he said finally. It was truth, if not complete truth. "That's a nice name," Liora said with the easy acceptance of childhood. "It sounds important." "Tell me about your mother," Cassian said, settling more comfortably on the cold stones. Something in the child's manner, her way of speaking, suggested education beyond what he might have expected from someone living in such circumstances. "Her name was Eleanor," Liora said, and the pride in her voice was unmistakable. "She used to work in the big palace in the kitchens. She made the most beautiful pastries. She taught me some of her recipes before she got sick. She said cooking was a way of taking care of people, of showing them you cared about their happiness." Elena. The name struck Cassian with the force of recognition, accompanied by a flood of memories he had thought buried beneath years of administrative concerns. Elena of the palace kitchens, a woman whose skill with delicate pastries had made royal banquets memorable, whose quiet efficiency had earned respect from demanding head cooks, whose gentle manner had made her well-liked among the palace staff. He remembered her clearly now, a woman perhaps 30 years old during the plague years, with dark hair and kind eyes, always impeccably clean despite working in the hot, chaotic environment of the palace kitchens. She had been one of dozens of palace servants he had known by face and reputation, someone whose work had contributed to the smooth operation of royal life, and he remembered the promise. During the worst days of the plague, when the sickness had spread through the palace like wildfire, claiming servants and nobles alike, Cassian had made rounds through the makeshift hospital wards set up in the palace's great halls. Elena had been among the sick, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored, but her concern had been entirely for others. "Your Majesty," she had whispered when he stopped beside her pallet, "if something happens to me, please remember my little girl. She has no other family, and she's so small, so dependent on me. Promise me she won't be forgotten." He had taken her hand, had looked into her fever-bright eyes, and had given his word. "No child of a faithful servant will be left without care." "You have my promise, Elena," but in the chaos that followed, the mounting death toll, the collapse of normal administrative procedures, the desperate efforts to contain the spreading sickness, that promise had been lost among 1,000 urgent concerns. Elena had died, along with hundreds of others, and somehow her daughter had slipped through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. Now, 5 years later, that forgotten promise stood before him in the form of a hungry child, searching through refuse for survival. The copper locket that had caught the torchlight earlier lay beside Liora's. Small pile of salvaged items, a few scraps of clean cloth, a piece of string, the precious bread crust. Cassian could see now that it was not refuse but treasure, at least to her. "May I see that?" he asked, gesturing to the locket. Liora hesitated, then picked it up carefully and held it out to him. "It was my mother's. It has her picture inside, but the clasp is broken, so I have to be very careful with it." Cassian opened the delicate mechanism with gentle hands. Inside, protected by tarnished copper, was a small painted portrait. Elena's face captured in miniature with remarkable skill. The image showed her as he remembered her, serene, kind, with the quiet dignity of someone who took pride in honest work well done. "She was beautiful," he said softly, and meant it. "And she raised a brave daughter. She always said I should be strong," Liora replied, "but also kind. She said being strong didn't mean being hard, that you could be both strong and gentle at the same time." The wisdom in those words, coming from this child who had survived years of hardship while maintaining her essential humanity, brought tears to Cassian's eyes. Here was Elena's true legacy, not just the recipes and skills she had passed on, but the character she had instilled in her daughter. "Liora," he said carefully, "would you be willing to come with me somewhere warm, somewhere with food and safety?" The wariness returned to her eyes. "Where?" People don't usually help unless they want something in return. The cynicism in those words, the hard-earned knowledge they represented, broke something in Cassian's heart. "I want nothing in return except the chance to honor a promise I made to your mother. She asked me to take care of you, and I failed to keep that promise. I would like the opportunity to make that right." For a long moment, Liora studied his face in the torchlight, her young eyes searching for signs of deception or hidden motive. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But I keep my mother's locket." "Of course," Cassian replied. "It belongs to you, as it should." As he helped her gather her few possessions, Cassian felt the weight of decision settling around him like the winter cloak on his shoulders. This moment would change everything. For him, for this forgotten child, and perhaps for his entire kingdom. But there was no choice to be made. Elena's daughter would not spend another night hungry and alone if he could prevent it. The walk back to the palace would be the first step in honoring a promise too long delayed. Elena's recipe book lay open on the polished oak table in Cassian's private study, its leather binding cracked with age and use, pages yellowed by years of kitchen steam and careful handling. The simple journal seemed almost sacred in the opulent surroundings, a testament to the practical wisdom of a woman who had transformed flour and eggs into moments of joy for those she served. Honey. "Cakes for the harvest festival," Cassian read aloud, his finger tracing Eleanor's careful handwriting. Mix with gentle hands, as rough treatment will make them tough. Like people, ingredients respond better to kindness than force. He paused, struck by the philosophy embedded in what appeared to be a simple cooking instruction. It had been 3 days since he had brought Liora to the palace, and those days had been filled with challenges neither he nor his staff had fully anticipated. The child sat now in the corner of his study, wrapped in a soft woolen blanket that dwarfed her small frame, her dark eyes taking in the rich tapestries and gleaming surfaces with a mixture of wonder and wariness. The transition had not been easy. Palace protocol provided no framework for an emperor arriving at dawn with a homeless child, and Chancellor Marius had spent the better part of that first morning attempting to manage the situation through existing administrative channels. Where should she be housed? Who would be responsible for her care? What documentation was required? How should her presence be explained to the court and the kingdom at large? "Your Majesty," Marius had said during their morning conference, his usual composure strained by the unprecedented circumstances, "I have consulted the palace regulations regarding temporary residence, charitable cases, and ward arrangements. Unfortunately, none of the existing protocols quite address this situation. The closest parallel would be the procedures for housing foreign dignitaries' children, but even those assume proper documentation and formal arrangements." Cassian had listened patiently to his chancellor's concerns, recognizing the genuine difficulty of integrating an unplanned element into the carefully structured world of imperial administration. But his answer had been simple. "Then we shall create new protocols. Liora is the daughter of a faithful servant who died in service to the crown. That service has earned her a place here, regardless of what our current procedures might specify." The search through Elena's belongings had been both heartbreaking and illuminating. Stored in the palace's administrative archives, along with the personal effects of dozens of other plague victims, her possessions painted a picture of a life lived with careful attention to both duty and beauty. Besides the recipe book, there were letters from distant relatives, pressed flowers from the palace gardens, and a small collection of simple jewelry that spoke of modest prosperity earned through honest work. Most significant had been a bundle of correspondence between Elena and the palace's head cook, Master Willem, detailing her progression from kitchen assistant to pastry specialist. The letters revealed not only her growing expertise, but also her character, her willingness to work extra hours during important state dinners, her kindness to younger servants, her pride in contributing to the palace's reputation for hospitality. She wrote to her sister in the eastern provinces, Cassian had explained to Liora as they examined the letters together. "She told her about you constantly, how proud she was of your quick mind, how you helped her practice new recipes, how you could already read better than children twice your age." Liora had listened with quiet intensity, her small hands touching each item as if trying to reconnect with memories of her mother's life. "She used to let me help measure ingredients," she had said softly. She said cooking was like magic, but the kind that fed people instead of tricking them. The revelation of other forgotten families had emerged from this investigation into Elena's background. In cross-referencing the records of plague victims, palace administrators had discovered dozens of cases where former servants' families had been left without support. Widows struggling to maintain households after losing their primary income. Children whose apprenticeships had been interrupted by their parents' deaths. Elderly relatives who had depended on palace wages for their survival. The numbers are disturbing. "Your Majesty," Marius had reported during their second day's review, "we have identified 43 families of former palace employees who appear to have received little or no assistance following their losses during the plague years. Some have managed to establish new means of support, but others seem to have fallen into genuine hardship. And this represents only palace staff," Captain Helena had added, having been drawn into the investigation by Cassian's request for her practical perspective. The broader population certainly includes many more cases of similar need that have gone unaddressed by our existing charitable institutions. The implications were sobering. The kingdom's administrative machinery, efficient in many ways, had failed to account for the human cost of crisis in the most fundamental sense, ensuring that those who had served faithfully were not abandoned in their time of greatest need. But it was Liora's adjustment to palace life that occupied most of Cassian's immediate attention. The child who had displayed such resilience in her survival on the streets found herself overwhelmed by the sheer scale and formality of her new environment. The servants, kind but unsure how to interact with someone whose status remained undefined, treated her with a mixture of sympathy and careful distance. Her first night had been marked by nightmares, not surprising given the trauma she had endured, but heartbreaking nonetheless. Cassian had found her huddled in the corner of the guest chamber assigned to her, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her mother's locket. "I dreamed I couldn't find her," she had whispered. "I dreamed she was calling for me, but I couldn't hear where the voice was coming from." He had spent that night sitting beside her bed, sharing quiet stories about Elena's time in the palace, her skill with delicate pastries, her laughter during kitchen celebrations, the respect she had earned from colleagues and supervisors alike. Gradually, Liora's tears had given way to wonder at learning about aspects of her mother's life she had never known. "She made cakes for the emperor?" Liora had asked with wide eyes. "Many times," Cassian had confirmed, "and he always complimented her work, though I suspect she never knew that her creations were specifically praised." The irony of the statement, that he was speaking of himself in the third person while sitting beside the daughter of the woman whose work he had indeed appreciated, was not lost on him. But maintaining the fiction of his identity seemed crucial to preserving the genuine quality of their relationship. During the days that followed, Liora had begun to display the intelligence and gentle spirit that Elena's letters had described. She asked thoughtful questions about the palace's operations, showed genuine interest in the servants' work, and demonstrated a natural empathy that drew people to her, despite their initial uncertainty about her presence. She has her mother's gift for putting people at ease. Master Willem had observed when Liora had spent an afternoon in the kitchens, watching the preparation of the evening meal with fascination. "And she remembers things. I showed her how to fold pastry dough just once, and she understood the technique immediately." But there were also moments that revealed the depth of trauma and loss she carried. Sometimes she would fall silent for long periods, staring out windows with an expression far too serious for her young face. Other times she would hoard food, unable to quite believe that meals would continue to be available without her having to search or work for them. Chancellor Marius, despite his initial concerns about protocol, had begun to see the positive impact of Liora's presence on palace morale. Servants who had grown accustomed to the formal routines of imperial life found themselves smiling more often, reminded by her wonder at simple things, the beauty of tapestries, the warmth of fires, the luxury of abundant food, of the privilege inherent in their daily surroundings. "She asks the most remarkable questions," he had admitted to Cassian during their evening review. "Yesterday, she wanted to know why some rooms have paintings of battles while others have pictures of gardens. When I explained that different rooms serve different purposes, she asked whether people felt different things when they looked at wars versus flowers. I found myself reconsidering the psychological impact of our decorative choices." As Cassian continued reading through Elena's recipes and notes, he began to see them as more than culinary instructions. They were a philosophy of service, an approach to caring for others that emphasized attention to individual needs and preferences. One margin note particularly struck him. "Lord Marcus prefers less sweetening in his morning pastries. Nobility does not require excess, but rather careful attention to what brings genuine pleasure." Lord Marcus, his own younger brother, killed in a border skirmish 7 years past, Elena had noticed and remembered such personal details about dozens of people she served, had taken pride in adapting her work to bring them individual joy. Perhaps, Cassian thought, this was what his kingdom had been missing. Not grander policies or more efficient administration, but the simple recognition that governance, like cooking, worked best when it paid attention to the specific needs and preferences of those it was meant to serve. Outside the study windows, snow had begun to fall again, and Liora pressed her face to the glass to watch the flakes drift past in the torchlight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "My mother used to say that snow made the world look new again, like it was giving everything a chance to start over." "Perhaps," Cassian replied, closing the recipe book gently. "That is exactly what we all need, a chance to start over, to do better than we have done before." The children's prayer scroll lay unrolled across Captain Helena's desk, its ancient parchment marked with centuries of reverent handling. The text, written in the formal script of the Old Kingdom, spoke of responsibilities that rulers bore toward the most vulnerable of their subjects. "Let no child hunger while the granaries hold grain. Let no orphan wander while houses stand empty. For the strength of a realm is measured, not by its armies, but by its care for those who cannot defend themselves." Helena had discovered the scroll in the palace archives while researching historical precedents for Cassian's growing concern about forgotten families. What had begun as an administrative exercise, documenting past charitable programs to guide current policy, had become something more personal as she found herself drawn into the deeper questions about duty and compassion that Liora's presence had raised. It had been a week since the child's arrival, and the palace was adapting to her presence in ways both subtle and profound. The kitchen staff had begun preparing smaller portions of elaborate pastries, partly in deference to Liora's simple tastes, but also because her wonder at basic abundance had reminded them that extravagance was not always the same as excellence. The servants moved more quietly through the halls, conscious that their new resident was still easily startled by sudden noises or movements. Most significantly, conversations throughout the palace had begun to shift. Where once discussions had centered on protocol and procedure, now they increasingly touched on questions of purpose and impact. Liora's presence served as a constant, gentle reminder that behind every administrative decision lay real people with real needs. She asked me yesterday why some rooms in the palace are kept locked when there are people in the city who have no rooms at all. Master Willem confided to Helena during one of their evening conversations. I found myself without a good answer. We preserve staterooms for ceremonial occasions that happen perhaps twice a year, while children like her, before His Majesty found her, sleep in alleyways. Helena nodded thoughtfully. Her own background had given her a perspective on such contradictions that most palace residents lacked. Born to a blacksmith's family in the capital's working quarter, she had earned her position through merit rather than inheritance, maintaining connections to the practical concerns of ordinary citizens that informed her approach to her duties. "The child has a gift for seeing what we have become blind to," she replied. "Perhaps that is what happens when someone experiences genuine need. They notice abundance where others see only normalcy." The revelation of Liora's living conditions since her mother's death had emerged gradually, through careful conversations that respected her natural reticence about painful memories. The picture that formed was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to human resilience and the unexpected kindness that could be found even in difficult circumstances. There was an old woman named Marta who sometimes let me sleep in a shop doorway when the weather was very bad. Liora had explained to Cassian during one of their quiet evening talks. She sold used clothes and bits of fabric, and she would give me scraps that I could use to patch my coat or bundle up for warmth. She never had much food to share, but she always made sure I knew I was welcome. "And did others help you as well?" Cassian had asked gently. "Sometimes the baker's wife would save me the burnt edges from her bread, the parts customers wouldn't buy. And there was a man who drove a cart for the merchants who would let me help him load goods in exchange for a few coins. People weren't mean mostly. They just had their own troubles to worry about. The matter-of-fact way Liora described her survival revealed both the depth of hardship she had endured and the essential optimism that had sustained her through it. She spoke of kindness received without bitterness, about kindness withheld, of help gratefully accepted without resentment, about help unavailable. But there were darker revelations as well. Stories of older children who had formed groups for mutual protection and shared resources, some of whom had been forced into theft or other desperate measures. Accounts of adults who had taken advantage of vulnerable children, offering shelter or food in exchange for labor or worse. A description of the constant wariness necessary for survival. The need to assess quickly whether strangers represented help or danger. I learned to tell who was safe, she had said, with the serious tone that sometimes replaced her natural childlike manner. Really hungry people usually don't hurt others. They understand what it feels like to need help. It's the ones who have enough but want more that you have to watch out for. The wisdom in such observations, born from experience no child should have to gain, had profound implications for how the kingdom addressed social problems. Liora's insights suggested that poverty and desperation were not the primary sources of cruelty or exploitation. Rather, it was often those with sufficient resources but insufficient compassion who posed the greatest threats to the vulnerable. Chancellor Marius had begun incorporating such perspectives into his policy recommendations, though not without initial resistance from some court advisers. During a recent council meeting, Lord Aldrich, one of the kingdom's wealthier nobles, had questioned the wisdom of basing administrative decisions on the observations of a street child. With respect, Your Majesty, he had argued, while the girl's story is certainly touching, we must be careful not to allow sentiment to override practical governance. The kingdom's resources are not unlimited, and expanding charitable programs based on anecdotal evidence could strain our treasury without necessarily addressing systemic issues. Cassian's response had been measured but firm. Lord Aldrich, I would suggest that someone who has survived years of genuine hardship might have insights into the effectiveness of existing support systems that those of us who have never faced such challenges could not provide. Her observations are not merely anecdotal, they represent lived experience of the consequences of our current policies. The exchange had highlighted a growing tension within the court between those who saw Liora's presence as an opportunity for meaningful reform and those who viewed it as a dangerous precedent that could lead to unrealistic expectations or unmanageable demands on royal resources. Captain Helena found herself increasingly aligned with the reform perspective, partly because of her own background, but also because of what she observed during her security rounds. The palace guards, who came from common families, were notably more supportive of expanded charitable efforts than those from noble households. They understood, from personal experience or family stories, how quickly circumstances could change and how thin the margin between security and desperation could be. My father lost his smithy to fire when I was 12, she had shared with Cassian, during one of their discussions about palace security arrangements. Without help from neighbors and the local guild, our family would have faced the same struggles this child has endured. It taught me that most people are only a few misfortunes away from needing assistance themselves. Such perspectives were beginning to influence not just charitable policies, but security protocols as well. Helena had quietly begun adjusting guard rotations to include more frequent patrols through the capital's poorer quarters, not as enforcement measures, but as community connections. Guards who understood the daily struggles of ordinary citizens were better positioned to distinguish between genuine threats and desperate actions born from need. Not the most encouraging development had been Liora's gradual emergence from the trauma-induced wariness that had initially marked her interactions with palace staff. As she began to trust that food and shelter would continue to be available, Her natural curiosity and intelligence had begun to flourish. She spent the afternoon in the library yesterday, Marius had reported with obvious pleasure. Brother Thomas found her looking at illuminated manuscripts, and when he offered to read to her, she surprised him by reading several passages herself. Her mother taught her well. Her literacy is remarkable for someone her age. Regardless of social background, more than literacy, Liora was displaying a natural wisdom about human nature that impressed everyone who spent time with her. She had an intuitive understanding of when people were troubled and a gentle way of offering comfort that never seemed intrusive or inappropriate. She noticed that one of the kitchen maids seemed sad. Master Willem had observed, and without being asked, she began helping with simple tasks, sorting beans, folding linens, small things that let the girl know someone cared about her difficulties. It was done so naturally, so kindly, that it lifted the spirits of everyone who witnessed it. As Helena rolled up the ancient prayer scroll, she reflected on how one child's presence was beginning to transform not just individual attitudes, but the very culture of the palace. The scroll's words about measuring a realm's strength through its care for the vulnerable were no longer abstract ideals, but practical challenges that demanded concrete responses. Outside her window, the evening watch was changing, guards moving through their careful routines with the same dedication they had always shown. But now, their duties carried additional meaning. They were protecting not just an institution, but a place where compassion was beginning to outweigh protocol, where the needs of the forgotten were becoming as important as the demands of the powerful. Perhaps, Helena thought, this was how real change happened. Not through grand proclamations or sweeping reforms, but through the simple presence of truth that made continuing in old ways impossible. The ledger of names sat heavy in Chancellor Marius's hands, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of administrative use. Page after yellowed page contained careful entries documenting palace staff from generations past, names, positions, wages, family members, dates of service. What had once been merely bureaucratic record-keeping now read like a catalogue of forgotten lives, each entry representing someone whose service had sustained the kingdom's daily operations. Gareth Miller, head gardener, served 18 years, survived by wife Agnes and 3 children. Eldest son apprenticed to the Stonemasons Guild, Marius read aloud during the morning briefing. Agnes Miller, seamstress, served 12 years, died of plague, survived by children now scattered to various trades and locations unknown. Cassian listened with growing concern as the litany continued. The comprehensive review he had ordered was revealing the true scope of administrative neglect, not malicious intent, but the kind of systematic oversight that occurred when human concerns became abstractions buried in procedural documentation. It had been 2 weeks since Liora's arrival, and her integration into palace life had proceeded with remarkable success. The child's natural resilience, combined with the genuine care she was receiving, had begun to heal the trauma of her years on the streets. But perhaps more significantly, her presence had catalyzed a fundamental examination of how the kingdom addressed the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. The numbers are staggering. Your Majesty, Marius continued, setting down the ledger and consulting his summary notes. We have identified 67 families of former palace employees who received little or no assistance following the deaths of their primary breadwinners during the plague years. Of these, 31 cases involved children who were left without adequate support or guidance, and this represents only palace staff, Captain Helena added from her position near the chamber's tall windows. The broader population undoubtedly includes hundreds more cases of similar abandonment by our social institutions. The implications were profound and troubling. The kingdom's administrative machinery, while efficient in many respects, had failed to maintain the human connections that should have ensured continuing care for those who had served faithfully. Families like Elena's had simply fallen through gaps in a system that prioritized current needs over lasting obligations. What resources would be required to address these cases? appropriately? Cassian asked, though he suspected the answer would not be simple. That depends largely on how comprehensively we choose to respond, Marius replied carefully. Basic subsistence support for the families currently in genuine need could be managed within existing charitable budgets, particularly if we redirect some funds from ceremonial expenses. However, if we seek to provide meaningful long-term assistance, apprenticeships for older children, housing support for widows, medical care for the elderly, the costs would be considerably higher. Lord Aldrich, who had been notably quiet during recent council sessions, finally spoke up with obvious concern. Your Majesty, while the humanitarian impulse behind these investigations is admirable, we must consider the broader implications of such expanded commitments. Word of comprehensive support for former palace families will inevitably spread throughout the kingdom. Soon we may face demands for similar assistance from every family that has experienced hardship, whether connected to royal service or not. And would that be problematic? Cassian asked mildly. Should we not be concerned with the welfare of all our subjects, not merely those who have direct connections to the palace? The question hung in the air, highlighting fundamental disagreements about the scope and purpose of royal responsibility. Traditional governance had focused primarily on maintaining order, defending borders, and managing trade. Charitable concerns were typically left to religious institutions or local community networks. But Liora's presence had raised uncomfortable questions about the adequacy of such arrangements. The royal treasury is not unlimited, Lord Aldrich continued, his tone becoming more pointed. Expanding charitable commitments beyond sustainable levels could compromise our ability to maintain essential services, military preparedness, infrastructure maintenance, diplomatic relations. A kingdom that bankrupts itself through excessive generosity serves no one well. There was logic in his argument, Cassian acknowledged privately. Resource allocation required careful balance, and good intentions without sustainable funding could lead to promises that ultimately could not be kept. But there was also wisdom in what he had learned from Elena's recipe book and Liora's observations, that attention to individual needs and circumstances often produced better results than broad, impersonal policies. Perhaps, he suggested, we should begin with a pilot program focused on the families we have already identified. This would allow us to develop effective procedures while assessing costs and benefits before considering broader expansion. The compromise seemed to satisfy most council members, though Lord Aldrich's expression suggested continued reservations. More encouraging was the enthusiasm shown by Captain Helena and several younger court officials who had been energized by the prospect of meaningful reform. As the formal council session concluded, Cassian found himself reflecting on the broader cultural changes that Liora's presence had sparked throughout the palace. The child's natural empathy and curiosity had created ripple effects that extended far beyond formal policy discussions. In the kitchens, Master Willem had begun experimenting with simpler, more nutritious meals that reflected appreciation for basic abundance rather than elaborate display. The child's delight in fresh bread and good soup reminded me that culinary art should nourish the spirit as well as impress the eye, he had explained. Among the palace guards, Helena reported increased attention to community concerns during their regular patrols. The men are noticing things they overlooked before. Families that seem to be struggling, children who appear unsupervised, elderly residents who might need assistance. They're not intervening inappropriately, but they're more aware of social conditions that might require attention. Even the palace's administrative staff had begun approaching their work with renewed purpose. Brother Thomas, the elderly librarian, had started organizing literacy classes for interested servants, inspired by Liora's love of reading. Education should not be a privilege reserved for the nobility, he had declared. Knowledge belongs to anyone willing to pursue it. But the most significant changes were occurring in Liora herself. The wary, hypervigilant child who had arrived 2 weeks ago was gradually giving way to someone more trusting and open. Her natural intelligence was flourishing in an environment where curiosity was encouraged rather than seen as potential danger. She asked me yesterday about the paintings in the Great Hall. Marius had shared during a quiet moment. Not just who was depicted, but why we choose to display images of past rulers. When I explained about honoring history and inspiring current leadership, she wondered whether we might also display pictures of people who had served the kingdom in other ways: soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, teachers. Her question made me realize how narrow our definition of worthiness has become. Such observations were becoming increasingly common as palace residents found themselves seeing familiar surroundings through fresh eyes. Liora's perspective, shaped by years of genuine hardship but unmarred by cynicism or bitterness, offered insights that challenged assumptions many had never thought to question. The evening brought Cassian's favorite time of day, the quiet hour he spent with Liora in his study, sharing stories and observations about the day's events. She had begun to trust him enough to share her own thoughts and questions without the careful caution that had initially marked their conversations. "The servants work very hard," she said as she curled up in the large chair beside his desk, wrapped in the soft blanket that had become her favorite comfort. "But they seem happy here, happier than many people I knew before. Is that because they're treated well, or because they feel their work matters?" The question demonstrated the sophisticated thinking that continued to surprise everyone who spent time with her. At 6 years old, she was already grasping complex relationships between dignity, purpose, and satisfaction that many adults never fully understood. "I think," Cassian replied thoughtfully, "that both elements are important. People need to know their basic needs will be met, but they also need to feel that their efforts contribute to something meaningful. Perhaps that is true for everyone, whether they work in palaces or fields or workshops. My mother used to say that any work done with care and kindness was important work," Liora said softly. "She said it didn't matter whether you were cooking for emperors or families, as long as you were trying to make people's lives a little better." Once again, Elena's wisdom spoke through her daughter's words, offering guidance that seemed increasingly relevant to the challenges of governance. Perhaps the secret to effective leadership lay not in grand strategies or complex policies, but in the simple recognition that every person deserved care and respect, that every act of service, no matter how humble, contributed to the kingdom's true strength. Outside the study windows, snow continued to fall on the capital, covering the city in pristine white that made even the humblest buildings look magnificent in the torchlight. Somewhere in those streets, other children might be facing the cold and hunger that Liora had endured. But now, at least, there was hope that such suffering would not go unnoticed or unaddressed. Change was coming to the kingdom, one careful step at a time. The broken crown chain lay in Master Theron's careful hands, its golden links separated where centuries of ceremonial weight had finally stressed the metal beyond endurance. The palace jeweler examined each piece with practiced eyes, but his expression suggested the damage went deeper than simple mechanical failure. "It will require complete reconstruction, Your Majesty," he explained to Cassian during their morning consultation. The original craftsmanship was exquisite, but the design prioritized appearance over structural integrity. To make it truly strong, we would need to sacrifice some of its decorative elements in favor of more robust construction. The metaphor was not lost on Cassian. Like the crown chain, many of the kingdom's institutions looked magnificent on the surface while harboring fundamental weaknesses that years of stress were beginning to reveal. Liora's presence had become a catalyst for examining not just charitable policies, but the entire framework of royal governance. It had been 3 weeks since her arrival, and the palace had settled into new rhythms that accommodated both her needs and the broader changes her presence had inspired. But outside the protective walls of the royal residence, Resistance to reform was beginning to crystallize among certain segments of the nobility. Lord Aldrich has been quite active in his correspondence lately, Chancellor Marius reported during their evening briefing. He has been consulting with other noble families about what he terms the concerning direction of recent policy initiatives. While he has not yet organized formal opposition, there are signs that some court families are growing nervous about the implications of expanded charitable commitments. The political dynamics were complex and potentially destabilizing. The kingdom's traditional power structure depended on a delicate balance between royal authority and noble privilege. Lords who controlled vast estates and commercial enterprises had historically supported the crown in exchange for policies that protected their interests and maintained social hierarchies. Cassian's growing emphasis on support for common citizens threatened to upset that arrangement. What specific concerns are they raising? Cassian asked, though he suspected he could anticipate the answer. Resource allocation is the primary issue, Marius replied. They argue that expanded charitable programs will require increased taxation, which will ultimately burden the very economic activities that generate the kingdom's prosperity. There are also concerns about creating dependencies. The suggestion that providing assistance to struggling families may discourage self-reliance and personal responsibility. Such arguments had surface plausibility, Cassian acknowledged. Economic policy required careful consideration of incentives and long-term sustainability. But he had also learned, through observing Liora's resilience and Elena's life story, that poverty was rarely a choice and that people given genuine opportunities generally seized them with remarkable determination. Captain Helena had been conducting her own investigation into the noble family's concerns, using her network of contacts among the palace guard and city watch to gather information about actual conditions beyond the court's rarefied atmosphere. The reality on the ground contradicts many of their assumptions, she reported. During a private conversation in Cassian's study, the families we have begun assisting are using the support to establish sustainable improvements to their situations, not simply consuming resources. A widow who received help with rent payments has been able to maintain her small weaving business. Children who were given access to apprenticeships are learning trades that will allow them to support themselves and eventually contribute to the kingdom's economic base. More troubling was Helena's discovery of corruption among some court officials who had been responsible for administering existing charitable programs. The investigation into forgotten families had revealed not just administrative neglect, but active misappropriation of funds intended for public welfare. Sir Marcus, who oversees distribution of royal arms, appears to have been skimming substantial amounts for personal use, Helena continued grimly. The records show payments to families who received no assistance, and several warehouse facilities supposedly storing emergency grain supplies are actually empty or contain spoiled goods, unsuitable for distribution. The revelation struck Cassian with particular force because it suggested that resources adequate for addressing social needs had been available all along. They had simply been diverted through institutional corruption rather than administrative inadequacy. How extensive is this mismanagement? He asked, dreading the answer. Preliminary estimates suggest that nearly 40% of charitable funds over the past 5 years have been misdirected, Helena replied. If those resources had reached their intended recipients, we could have prevented much of the suffering that children like Liora have endured. The implications were staggering. The kingdom's failure to care for its most vulnerable citizens was not primarily a matter of insufficient resources or competing priorities. It was a consequence of systemic dishonesty that had betrayed the trust of both the crown and the people it was meant to serve. That evening brought an unexpected crisis that tested everyone's commitment to the changes Liora's presence had inspired. The child, who had been steadily recovering from the trauma of her years on the streets, suddenly fell ill with a fever that recalled the terrifying days of the plague epidemic. Palace physicians responded immediately, but their initial examination could not determine whether her condition represented a minor childhood ailment or something more serious. The possibility that the plague might be returning to the capital sent ripples of fear throughout the palace and surrounding city. She keeps asking for her mother. The head physician reported to Cassian with obvious concern. The fever has left her confused about time and place. She seems to believe she is still living on the streets, still searching for Elena. Cassian found himself experiencing emotions he had not felt since Lydia's death. The helpless terror of watching someone precious slip away despite all efforts to protect them. Liora had become more than just a responsibility or a symbol of royal conscience. She had become genuinely dear to him, filling a space in his heart that he had thought permanently closed. He spent the night beside her bed, offering what comfort he could as she drifted between feverish sleep and confused waking. During the worst moments, when her temperature spiked and her breathing became labored, he found himself praying with an intensity he had not experienced since his wife's final illness. "Please don't take her too," he whispered to whatever forces governed human fate. "She has suffered enough already, and there is so much good she could still accomplish in this world." As dawn approached, the fever began to break, and Liora's breathing settled into a more natural rhythm. When she finally opened her eyes and focused on his face, the recognition in her gaze brought tears of relief he did not attempt to hide. "Cassian," she said weakly, "I had such strange dreams. I thought I was lost again, but you kept calling my name so I could find my way back." "You are safe," he assured her, smoothing her damp hair away from her forehead. "You are home, and you will always be safe here." The word home had slipped out naturally, but as soon as he spoke it, Cassian realized how completely true it had become. This child, who had arrived as a reminder of forgotten obligations, had transformed into something much more personal, a daughter of his heart, if not his blood, someone whose well-being had become central to his own sense of purpose and meaning. The crisis had also clarified something important about the resistance to reform he was facing from certain noble families. Their concerns about resource, allocation and social dependencies seemed trivial, compared to the fundamental question of whether the kingdom would honor its obligations to protect those who could not protect themselves. As Liora recovered her strength over the following days, word of her illness and the Emperor's vigil spread throughout the palace and beyond. The story resonated with people who understood the depth of love and commitment her care represented, strengthening support for the charitable reforms while highlighting the personal stakes involved in policy decisions. "The people see something genuine in your concern for this child," Marius observed during their first council meeting after the crisis. "It demonstrates that the new policies arise from authentic compassion rather than political calculation. That authenticity makes opposition more difficult to sustain." Master Theron completed his repair of the crown chain using a design that emphasized strength over ornate appearance. The result was less flashy than the original, but more durable, better suited to the weight it would bear, perhaps, Cassian thought as he examined the jeweler's work. That was exactly the kind of transformation his kingdom needed, less concerned with impressive appearances, more focused on the fundamental strength required to support all its people through whatever challenges the future might bring. The hidden royal birth certificate lay beneath a loose floorboard in Master Aldwin's quarters, its parchment yellowed with age, but its elegant script still clearly legible. The dying physician's hands trembled as he extracted the document from its hiding place, his weathered face marked by the weight of a secret he had carried for 7 long years. "Your Majesty," he whispered to Cassian, who had come in response to an urgent summons from the palace medical staff, "there is something about the child, about Liora, that you must know before I pass from this world." It had been a month since Liora's fever had broken, and she had recovered with the remarkable resilience of youth. But her illness had served as a catalyst for Aldwin's conscience, forcing him to confront a truth he had hidden out of what he believed was protective love. The old physician had served the palace for 40 years, attending births and deaths, treating injuries and ailments with equal dedication. He'd been present during the plague years, working tirelessly to save lives, even as the sickness claimed colleagues and friends around him. His integrity was unquestioned, his loyalty to the crown absolute, which made his obvious distress all the more concerning. "Speak freely," Cassian encouraged, settling into the chair beside Aldwin's bed. "What weighs so heavily on your conscience?" "The child is not merely Elena's daughter," Aldwin began, his voice gaining strength despite his physical weakness. "She is also royal blood, the legitimate daughter of your brother, Prince Marcus." The words struck Cassian like a physical blow, reshaping everything he thought he understood about Liora's identity and place in the kingdom. Prince Marcus, his younger brother by 5 years, had died in a border skirmish 7 years past, cut down by enemy arrows while leading a cavalry charge. The loss had devastated Cassian both personally and politically, as Marcus had been not only beloved family, but also his designated heir in the absence of children from his own marriage to Lydia. "That is impossible," Cassian said automatically. "Marcus never married. There were no announcements, no ceremonies, no documentation of any royal union. There was a secret marriage," Aldwin insisted, reaching for a leather pouch that contained additional documents. Prince Marcus fell deeply in love with Elena during the months before his final campaign. She was working in the palace kitchens then, and their paths crossed during his frequent visits to oversee provisions for his military unit. The physician's account painted a picture that was both romantic and heartbreaking. Marcus, a young man known for his honor and sincerity, had been immediately drawn to Elena's quiet dignity and gentle manner. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on genuine affection and mutual respect, rather than the political calculations that typically guided royal marriages. The prince understood the political complications such a union would create. Aldwin continued, producing a second document, a marriage certificate bearing the seals of a country priest and signed with Marcus's distinctive hand. But he also believed that love rooted in true compatibility would serve the kingdom better than an alliance based solely on strategic advantage. Cassian examined the marriage certificate with growing amazement. The document was authentic. He recognized not only Marcus's signature, but also the particular phrasing his brother favored in formal documents. The ceremony had taken place in a small chapel outside the capital, witnessed by the priest and 2 trusted companions who had since died in the same battle that claimed Marcus's life. Elena was already carrying the prince's child when he left for the borderlands, Aldwin revealed. She had planned to announce the marriage upon his return, when they could face whatever political consequences might arise together. But when news of his death reached the palace, she begged me to help keep the secret, fearing that revealing the marriage would endanger both herself and her unborn child. The logic of Elena's decision became clear as Cassian considered the political dynamics that had existed 7 years ago, with both the emperor and his heir having died childless, for Lydia's own death had followed soon after Marcus's. The succession would have fallen to distant cousins whose claims were less clear and whose loyalty was questionable. A secret marriage to a common-born woman producing a potential heir of mixed blood would have created a succession crisis at the worst possible moment. "So she chose to remain silent," Cassian said, understanding the sacrifice Elena had made. "She protected the kingdom's stability by accepting that her daughter would never be acknowledged as royal." "Exactly," Aldwin confirmed. "And I helped her maintain that fiction, believing it was the wisest course for everyone involved. But when the plague took Elena, I was faced with a terrible choice. I could reveal Liora's true parentage and thrust a young child into the dangerous world of court politics, or I could allow her to disappear into the common population, hoping she would find safety in obscurity, and you chose obscurity," Cassian said, his voice neutral despite the turmoil of emotions the revelation had created. "I thought it was protecting her," Aldwin said, tears now flowing freely down his lined cheeks. "I thought she would be safer as an unknown orphan than as a royal bastard, for that is how the court would have seen her, regardless of the marriage certificate. But watching her these past weeks, seeing how she has flourished under your care, I realize I condemned her to years of unnecessary suffering. The implications of this revelation were staggering on multiple levels. Personally, it meant that the child he had come to love as a daughter was actually his niece, the last living link to his beloved brother. Politically, it meant that the kingdom's succession, which had seemed secure through his own continued rule, was actually uncertain. For if Liora was legitimate royal blood, she had a stronger claim to the throne than any of the distant cousins who currently stood to inherit. "There is more," Aldwin continued, reaching into the leather pouch one final time. "Prince Marcus gave Elena this before departing for the borderlands, with instructions that it should be passed to their child as proof of royal heritage. The object he produced was instantly recognizable: Prince Marcus's personal signet ring, smaller than the imperial seal but bearing the same dragon crest, inscribed with the secondary markings that identified it as belonging to the heir apparent. Cassian had seen his brother wear it countless times, had watched him use it to seal personal correspondence and informal agreements. As he held the familiar ring, memories of Marcus flooded back: his brother's laughter, his idealistic vision of leadership based on merit rather than birth, his belief that the monarchy's future lay in connection with the people rather than separation from them. In many ways, Liora embodied the values Marcus had championed, displaying the same natural empathy and concern for others' welfare that had made the prince beloved by common soldiers and nobles alike. "What would you have me do with this knowledge?" Cassian asked finally, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That choice belongs to you, Your Majesty," Aldwin replied. "But I wanted you to have all the facts before making any decisions about the child's future. She is not just a reminder of forgotten obligations. She is your brother's daughter, your own blood, and potentially the kingdom's rightful heir." The political complexity was immense. Revealing Leora's true identity would legitimize her claim to succession, but also create enormous controversy about her mixed heritage and unconventional upbringing. Keeping the secret would preserve stability, but deny her the birthright that Marcus had intended her to inherit. More immediately, it would transform Cassian's relationship with the child in ways both wonderful and complicated. The parental feelings he had developed toward her were now revealed to have a genetic basis. She was not just someone he had chosen to care for, but family in the most literal sense. As if summoned by the intensity of his thoughts, Liora appeared in the doorway of Aldwin's chamber, her face bright with the curiosity that had become her trademark since recovering from her fever. "Cassian," she said in the informal tone that had become natural between them, "Master Willem is teaching me to make honey cakes like my mother used to prepare. Would you like to help? He says cooking is more fun when people work together." Looking at her now, Cassian could see resemblances to Marcus that he had somehow missed before. The shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the unconscious grace of her movements. She carried her royal heritage in her very bearing, though she remained completely unaware of its significance. "I would be honored to help," he said gently, making his decision even as he spoke. Whatever complications this revelation might create, Liora deserved to know the truth about her identity and her place in the kingdom. She was Princess Liora, daughter of Prince Marcus, and it was time for that reality to be acknowledged. But first, there were careful preparations to make, conversations to have, and plans to develop for managing the political earthquake that this announcement would inevitably create. The kingdom was about to discover that their unknown princess had been living among them all along, hidden not by conspiracy, but by the protective love of those who had believed anonymity would keep her safe. Soon, Everyone would learn what Cassian was only now beginning to understand, that the lost child he had found searching through refuse was not just someone in need of rescue, but the key to the kingdom's future. The ancient succession scrolls covered the entire surface of the great table in the palace's most secure archive chamber, their parchment surfaces bearing the accumulated wisdom of centuries of legal precedent and royal tradition. Brother Matthias, the kingdom's chief legal scholar, traced delicate fingers across passages written in the formal script of long-dead scribes, his weathered face grave with the weight of constitutional implications. The law is quite clear on this matter. Your Majesty, he said after hours of careful study, a child born of legitimate royal marriage, regardless of the social status of either parent, possesses full rights of succession according to birth order and proximity to the throne. Princess Liora's claim supersedes that of any collateral relatives, including your own cousins. 2 weeks had passed since Master Aldwin's deathbed revelation, and Cassian had used that time to verify every aspect of the dying physician's account. The marriage certificate had been authenticated by comparison with other documents bearing Prince Marcus's seal. The priest who had performed the ceremony was deceased, but parish records confirmed his presence at the chapel on the date in question. Most convincingly, Liora herself bore unmistakable physical resemblances to Marcus that became increasingly apparent once one knew to look for them. But confirming her identity was only the beginning of challenges that the revelation had created. The Winter Solstice ceremony, now just 3 days away, would provide the traditional occasion for major royal announcements. Cassian had decided to use that forum to publicly acknowledge Liora's true identity, but the political preparation required for such a disclosure was proving enormously complex. The noble families are already unsettled by the expansion of charitable programs, Chancellor Marius warned during their latest strategy session. Learning that a common-born child has a legitimate claim to the throne will create panic among those who have positioned themselves to benefit. From the current succession arrangements, the political mathematics was sobering. Lord Aldrich and his allies had been assuming that Cassian's death would eventually bring them increased influence through their relationships with distant royal cousins. The discovery of a direct heir, particularly one whose common upbringing might predispose her toward policies favoring ordinary citizens over noble privilege, threatened to upset decades of careful political positioning. Lord Aldrich has been particularly active in recent correspondence. Captain Helena reported from her ongoing intelligence gathering. He has been consulting with legal scholars about potential challenges to irregular succession claims. There are suggestions that some nobles might question the validity of a secret marriage or argue that royal blood mixed with common heritage creates constitutional complications. Such arguments had little legal merit, according to Brother Matthias's research, but they could still create political turmoil if enough powerful families decided to pursue them. The kingdom's stability depended partly on the consent of major noble houses, and their support could not be taken for granted if they perceived their interests to be threatened. More concerning were the security implications that Helena had identified through her network of contacts in the city guard and beyond. Word of significant changes at the palace had begun to spread through unofficial channels, creating speculation and rumors that could potentially attract unwanted attention to Liora's situation. There are reports of strangers asking questions about recent palace activities. Helena explained to Cassian during a private briefing. Nothing specifically threatening yet, but the pattern suggests that outside forces may be taking interest in our internal affairs. If news of the princess's identity spreads before we are ready to announce it officially, we could face complications from neighboring kingdoms or rival factions within our own nobility. The regional political landscape added another layer of complexity to the situation. Several neighboring kingdoms maintained competing claims to various territories or trade rights, and the appearance of instability in the succession could encourage them to press their advantages. An heir whose legitimacy was questioned, or whose support base was uncertain, might invite external interference at exactly the wrong moment. Yet despite these daunting challenges, there were also encouraging signs of support for the changes that Liora's presence had inspired. The pilot charitable programs had produced demonstrable results that were difficult for even skeptical nobles to ignore. Families receiving assistance had used the support to establish sustainable improvements to their situations, and the economic benefits were beginning to ripple through the broader community. The marketplace reports increased activity from families that have received aid, reported Master Willem, who had been tracking the economic impact of charitable expenditures. People with stable housing and adequate food are spending more on goods and services, creating demand that benefits merchants and craftsmen throughout the capital. More significantly, the cultural changes within the palace had begun to influence attitudes throughout the kingdom's administrative structure. Officials at all levels were approaching their duties with renewed attention to human impact, and the quality of governance was improving in ways both subtle and profound. District administrators are submitting more detailed reports about local conditions, Marius noted with evident satisfaction. They are paying attention to social problems they might have overlooked previously, and their recommendations are becoming more thoughtful and comprehensive. But it was Liora herself who remained the most compelling argument for the changes her revelation would bring. The child who had survived years on the streets through resilience and compassion was proving equally adaptable to life as an acknowledged member of the royal family. Her natural intelligence, combined with formal education now available to her, was flourishing in ways that suggested she could indeed fulfill the demanding role that her birthright would eventually require. She asked me yesterday about the difference between ruling and governing. Brother Thomas shared during one of their evening discussions. When I explained that ruling meant having power, while governing meant using power wisely for others' benefit, she wanted to know why anyone would want to rule if they couldn't govern well. Her questions reveal a moral sophistication that many adults never develop. The education program designed for Liora was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated. Her literacy skills, already strong thanks to Elena's teaching, were rapidly expanding to include history, mathematics, geography, and the complex etiquette required for formal court life. But more importantly, she was learning about the practical aspects of administration and leadership through direct observation of daily palace operations. She spent the afternoon with the household steward, learning about supply management and budgeting, Marius reported with obvious pride. Her questions were remarkably insightful. She wanted to understand not just how resources were allocated, but why certain priorities were chosen over others. She is developing exactly the kind of analytical thinking that effective leadership requires. Perhaps most encouraging was Liora's response to learning about her true identity. Cassian had approached the conversation with considerable anxiety, uncertain how a 7-year-old child would react to discovering she was a princess with legitimate claims to royal succession. But her response had been characteristically thoughtful and mature. "Does this mean I have to stop being myself?" She had asked after absorbing the basic facts about her parentage and inheritance. "What do you mean?" Cassian had replied, genuinely curious about her concerns. "Well, I like helping in the kitchens and talking to the guards and learning about how things work," she had explained. "If I'm a princess, will people expect me to just sit in fancy rooms and have other people do everything for me? Because that sounds very lonely." Her question had revealed an intuitive understanding of the central challenge facing any member of the royal family: how to exercise authority without losing connection to the people being served. It was a problem that Cassian himself had struggled with throughout his reign, and one that had motivated his nighttime walks through the capital in search of genuine understanding. "Being a princess means having special responsibilities," he had explained. "But it doesn't mean you have to stop caring about others or learning about how the kingdom really works." In fact, those qualities will make you a better leader than someone who only knows about life in palaces. As the Winter Solstice ceremony approached, final preparations were consuming the attention of the entire palace staff. The Great Hall was being decorated with traditional symbols of renewal and hope, and invitations had been sent to noble families throughout the kingdom, as well as representatives from various trades and social groups. This year's ceremony would be larger and more inclusive than usual, reflecting the changes in perspective that Liora's presence had inspired. But for Cassian, the most important preparation was emotional rather than logistical. The announcement he was about to make would transform not only his relationship with Liora, but the entire trajectory of the kingdom's future. The scared, hungry child he had found searching through refuse would soon be acknowledged as Princess Liora, heir to the throne and symbol of a new approach to royal responsibility. Standing at the windows of his private chamber, looking out over the capital that sparkled with festive lights in preparation for the solstice celebration, Cassian reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a chance encounter in a dark alley had become a transformation that touched every aspect of governance and social policy. Tomorrow, his people would learn that their lost princess had been among them all along, hidden not by conspiracy, but by the protective love of those who had believed anonymity would keep her safe. They would discover that the future of their kingdom lay not in the hands of distant nobles, but in those of a child who understood both privilege and hardship, who had learned compassion through suffering and wisdom through necessity. The ceremony would mark not just Liora's acknowledgement as royal heir, but the kingdom's commitment to a new vision of leadership, one based on connection rather than separation, on service rather than dominance, on the understanding that true strength came not from the ability to command, but from the wisdom to care for those who could not care for themselves. As night settled over the capital, Cassian felt a peace he had not experienced since the early days of his reign. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, he and the remarkable child who had reminded him that the most important discoveries often came not from seeking grand adventures, but from paying attention to the needs of those closest at hand. The ceremonial royal scepter caught the morning light streaming through the great hall's soaring windows, its ancient gold surface reflecting centuries of tradition and authority. Cassian held the artifact with steady hands, feeling the weight of both metal and responsibility as he prepared for the most significant announcement of his 30-year reign. The Winter Solstice ceremony had drawn the largest gathering in recent memory. Noble families filled the ornate chairs arranged near the throne, their silk and velvet garments creating a tapestry of wealth and privilege. But this year's assembly also included representatives from trades guilds, respected merchants, decorated soldiers, and even carefully selected citizens whose service to the community had earned them recognition, a deliberate departure from traditional exclusivity that had already drawn murmurs of surprise from some quarters. Liora stood beside his throne, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her dark hair while maintaining the understated elegance that had become her preference. The transformation from the ragged child he had found 6 weeks ago was remarkable, yet her essential character remained unchanged. The same quiet dignity, the same thoughtful attention to those around her, the same gentle strength that had enabled her survival on the streets. "Citizens of our realm," Cassian began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "we gather today not merely to observe the ancient traditions of the winter solstice, but to reflect on the bonds that unite us as a people and the responsibilities we bear toward one another." The opening words were carefully chosen to establish themes of unity and mutual obligation rather than hierarchy and privilege. Around the hall, faces showed varying degrees of interest and curiosity. The common citizens seemed engaged, while some nobles appeared uncertain about the direction of his remarks. 6 weeks ago, On a night when the winter cold reminded us of our shared vulnerability to forces beyond our control. I walked among you as a simple citizen seeking to understand the true condition of our kingdom. A ripple of surprise moved through the assembly as he acknowledged his secret excursions beyond the palace walls. What I discovered challenged everything I believed about the effectiveness of our governance and the adequacy of our compassion. He paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle over the gathered crowd. I found children living in circumstances no child should endure, families struggling despite their honest efforts, people whose service to this realm had been forgotten when they most needed our support. Lord Aldrich's face had grown visibly tense, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious concern about where these remarks might lead. Other noble families showed similar unease, while the common citizens appeared increasingly interested in what promises of change the Emperor might be offering. Among those I encountered was a young girl whose courage and dignity in the face of hardship reminded me of what true nobility looks like, not the nobility of birth or wealth, but the nobility of character that emerges when people choose compassion over selfishness, hope over despair, service over privilege. Cassian gestured toward Liora, and she stepped forward with the poise that Master Thomas had been teaching her. Her head held high despite the hundreds of eyes now focused on her small figure. "This is Liora," he continued, "whose presence among us has awakened a renewed commitment to the principles that should guide all. Governance, that our strength as a kingdom depends not on the grandeur of our palaces, but on the welfare of our people, not on the distance we maintain from suffering, but on our willingness to address it directly." The crowd's attention was completely focused now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Even the most cynical nobles appeared caught up in the unusual nature of the ceremony, though their expressions suggested continuing uncertainty about its implications. Over these past weeks, Liora's insights have guided us toward policies that better serve those who need our assistance, while strengthening the economic and social foundations that benefit all citizens. The pilot programs we have implemented demonstrate that compassionate governance and practical effectiveness are not competing priorities but complementary approaches to leadership. The specific policy achievements provided concrete evidence for the more abstract principles he was articulating. Families receiving assistance had indeed used the support to establish sustainable improvements, and the economic benefits were beginning to ripple through the broader community in measurable ways. But today's ceremony marks not just the continuation of these efforts, but a revelation that transforms our understanding of what has transpired. The tension in the hall was now palpable, as everyone sensed that the real announcement was about to come. Cassian lifted Prince Marcus's signet ring from the ceremonial table beside his throne, its smaller dragon crest instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with royal regalia. The sight of the artifact, known to have been buried with the prince 7 years ago, sent a shock of recognition through the noble families who remembered its significance. 7 years ago, this kingdom mourned the loss of Prince Marcus, my beloved brother and designated heir. We believed his death had ended his contribution to our realm's future. He paused, his voice growing heavy with emotion that was entirely genuine. We were wrong. The silence in the great hall was absolute, every person present recognizing that they were about to witness a moment that would reshape the kingdom's history. Noble families who had positioned themselves to benefit from the current succession arrangements now faced the possibility that everything they had assumed was about to change. Liora remained calm beside the throne, though Cassian could see the slight tremor in her hands that revealed her nervousness about the announcement that would transform her life forever. In moments, the child who had spent years unknown and forgotten would be acknowledged as Princess Liora, heir to the throne and symbol of the kingdom's future. The revelation was about to begin. The royal signet of Prince Marcus gleamed in Cassian's palm as he held it high for all to see. its familiar dragon crest instantly recognizable to every noble family that had attended Marcus's funeral 7 years past. The sight of the ring, supposedly buried with its owner, sent a wave of stunned whispers through the great hall. This signet bears witness to a truth that has remained hidden for 7 years, Cassian declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly electric atmosphere. Before his final campaign, Prince Marcus entered into a legitimate marriage, blessed by the church and sealed with proper legal documentation. His bride was Elena of the palace kitchens, a woman whose character and virtue earned my brother's deepest love and respect. The revelation struck the assembly like a thunderbolt. Noble families who remembered Elena, the quiet, competent woman who had created such beautiful pastries for royal celebrations, struggled to process the implications. A marriage between a prince and a commoner was unusual, but not unprecedented in the kingdom's history, though such unions typically involved formal announcements and elaborate ceremonies. Their union was kept secret at Prince Marcus's request, Cassian continued, producing the marriage certificate that Brother Matthias had authenticated not from shame or hesitation, but from his desire to protect his bride from the political complications that such a revelation might create during wartime. He planned to announce their marriage upon his return from the borderlands, when they could face any challenges together. Lord Aldrich's face had gone ashen as the full implications began to register. A legitimate marriage meant legitimate children, and legitimate children meant a direct challenge to the succession arrangements that he and his allies had been counting on for their future influence. Elena carried Marcus's child when he departed. For his final campaign, Cassian announced, his voice growing stronger as he approached the climactic revelation. That child survived the plague that claimed her mother, survived years of hardship and neglect that should never have been permitted, and now stands before you as living proof that hope can emerge from the darkest circumstances. He turned toward Liora, extending his hand to guide her forward to the center of the great hall where everyone could see her clearly. She moved with the grace that months of palace life had cultivated, but her expression remained humble and sincere rather than imperious or demanding. "Citizens of our realm," Cassian declared with formal ceremony, "I present to you Princess Liora, daughter of Prince Marcus, granddaughter of the late Emperor Maximilian, niece to your current sovereign, and rightful heir to the throne of this kingdom." The response was immediate and dramatic. Common citizens, who had been following the story with growing amazement, erupted in cheers of joy and wonder. It was a tale that captured every element of hope they could imagine. A lost princess found, a child rescued from poverty, a kingdom awakened to compassion through the suffering of its most vulnerable member. The noble family's reactions were more complex and considerably more subdued. Some appeared genuinely moved by the romantic tragedy of Marcus and Elena's story, while others were clearly calculating the political implications of this unexpected development. A few, led by Lord Aldrich, showed open dismay at the destruction of their carefully laid succession plans. "The documentation is authentic and complete," Cassian continued, raising his voice above the crowd's reactions. "Princess Liora's legitimacy is beyond legal challenge. Her royal blood is unquestionable, and her claim to succession supersedes all other potential heirs according to our kingdom's established laws." He gestured toward Brother Matthias, who stepped forward with the ancient succession scrolls that had been prepared for this moment. The elderly scholar's presence lent additional weight to the announcement, as his reputation for legal expertise was respected throughout the kingdom. But titles and bloodlines alone do not make a worthy ruler, Cassian declared, his tone shifting from formal proclamation toward more personal reflection. Character, wisdom, and genuine concern for others' welfare, these are the qualities that enable true leadership. In Princess Liora, you will find not just legitimate royal heritage, but also the strength of spirit that comes from understanding hardship, the compassion that emerges from personal suffering, and the wisdom that can only be gained through genuine connection with all levels of society. Liora stepped forward then, her young voice carrying clearly through the great hall, despite her obvious nervousness. "I promise to use whatever position I may hold to serve all our people, remembering always that true nobility comes not from the circumstances of birth, but from the choices we make in service to others." The simple sincerity of her words seemed to touch even some of the skeptical nobles. Here was not an arrogant child demanding privilege, but a thoughtful young person accepting responsibility with appropriate humility. Princess Liora will be educated and prepared for the demanding role that her heritage requires, Cassian announced. But that education will include continued connection with citizens from all walks of life, ensuring that she understands not just the theory of governance, but its practical impact on real people's daily lives. As the formal announcement concluded and the crowd began to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed, Cassian felt a profound sense of completion. The lost child he had found searching through refuse was now acknowledged as the kingdom's rightful heir. But more importantly, she represented a new approach to leadership based on compassion rather than dominance, service rather than privilege. The transformation was complete, both for Liora personally and for the kingdom's understanding of what true nobility could mean. The new imperial charter lay open on the great table where once only ceremonial documents had been displayed, its fresh parchment bearing the signatures of representatives from every level of society. 6 months had passed since the Winter Solstice revelation, and the kingdom that emerged from that transformation bore little resemblance to the rigid hierarchy that had existed before Princess Liora's acknowledgement. The summer harvest reports are the most encouraging we have received in decades, Chancellor Marius announced during the morning briefing, his voice reflecting satisfaction that had become increasingly common in recent months. Families receiving assistance through our support programs have contributed significantly to agricultural productivity, and the economic benefits continue to ripple throughout the kingdom. The statistics were remarkable, but not surprising to those who had observed the changes firsthand. When people had stable housing and adequate nutrition, they could focus their energies on productive work rather than mere survival. When children received education and apprenticeships, they developed skills that enhanced the kingdom's overall capabilities. When communities felt genuinely supported by their government, they responded with increased civic engagement and social responsibility. Princess Liora sat at the table beside Cassian, no longer the uncertain child who had once clutched her mother's locket in desperate hunger, but not yet the formal adult she would eventually become. At 7 years old, she was learning to balance the requirements of royal education with the practical understanding that had made her such an effective catalyst for reform. The literacy programs have exceeded all expectations, Brother Thomas reported with obvious pride. We now have reading classes operating in 15 districts throughout the capital, with additional programs planned for the surrounding provinces. Parents who learn to read alongside their children are reporting increased opportunities for employment and civic participation. The educational initiatives had grown organically from Liora's own love of learning and her question about why knowledge should be limited to the nobility. What had begun as informal lessons for palace servants had expanded into a comprehensive program that was transforming social mobility throughout the kingdom. And the apprenticeship expansions, Cassian asked, reviewing the detailed reports that had replaced the superficial summaries he had once received. Master, Willem has established partnerships with craftsmen throughout the capital, Captain Helena replied from her new position overseeing the family assistance programs. Young people who might otherwise have remained trapped in poverty now have clear pathways to develop valuable skills and establish independent livelihoods. The transformation in Helena's role reflected broader changes in how the kingdom approached social policy. Rather than treating charitable assistance as temporary relief, The new programs focused on creating sustainable improvements that would benefit both individuals and the broader community over the long term. Most significantly, the noble families who had initially opposed the reforms had gradually come to recognize their benefits. Lord Aldrich, who had been among the most vocal critics, now served as an active supporter of expanded social programs. After witnessing their economic impact on his own estates, the tenants on my lands are more productive and prosperous than they have been in my lifetime, he had admitted during a recent council session. When people have security and opportunity, they contribute more effectively to everyone's welfare. The princess's insights about governance have proven remarkably practical as well as compassionate. The political transformation had been as dramatic as the social changes. The court culture that had once prioritized ceremony and hierarchy now emphasized results and responsiveness. Nobles who adapted to the new expectations thrived, while those who clung to outdated approaches found their influence diminishing through natural rather than punitive processes. The regional administrators are requesting permission to implement similar programs in their jurisdictions, Marius continued. Word of our success has spread to neighboring kingdoms, and we are receiving inquiries about sharing our methodologies with other realms, seeking to address comparable challenges. Liora had become the unofficial ambassador for these exchanges, meeting with visiting dignitaries who wanted to understand how such comprehensive reforms had been achieved so quickly. Her combination of royal authority and practical experience made her uniquely qualified to explain both the policies themselves and the philosophical principles that guided them. Change happens when people see genuine care translated into effective action, she had told a delegation from the Eastern Kingdoms. Programs that emerge from real understanding of people's needs work better than policies created from abstract theories about what might be helpful. The wisdom in such observations, coming from someone so young yet so experienced in the realities of hardship, continued to impress everyone who encountered her. She was developing exactly the kind of leadership skills that the kingdom's future would require. The ability to combine emotional intelligence with practical problem-solving, royal authority with genuine humility. As evening approached and the official business of the day concluded, Cassian found himself standing once again at the windows of his private chamber, gazing out over the capital that had been transformed by 6 months of purposeful reform. The city looked different now, not just in the physical improvements that increased prosperity had enabled, but in the quality of life that was visible in its streets and markets. Families moved with confidence rather than anxiety. Children played with the carefree joy that came from security rather than uncertainty. Adults engaged in the kind of productive commerce that created wealth rather than merely redistributing existing resources. "It's beautiful," Liora said, joining him at the window with the quiet grace that had replaced her earlier wariness. "But not just because of the buildings or the lights. It feels different. Like people believe their lives can get better instead of just hoping they won't get worse." Her observation captured the essential transformation that had occurred. Hope, grounded in realistic opportunities for improvement, had replaced the resignation that characterized so many communities struggling with systemic neglect. "Your mother would be proud," Cassian said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She taught you to see what matters most, not the surface appearance of things, but the human reality beneath." "I think she would be proud of you too," Liora replied, with the directness that had never left her, despite her royal education. "You could have remained distant and formal, but instead you chose to learn and change. That's harder for adults than for children, isn't it?" The question demonstrated the continuing wisdom that made her such an effective catalyst for positive change. At 7 years old, she already understood that true leadership required the courage to acknowledge mistakes and the humility to seek better approaches. As another winter solstice approached, the first anniversary of their initial meeting in that dark alley, Cassian reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a chance encounter with a hungry child had become a comprehensive transformation of how the kingdom understood its responsibilities to its people. The lost princess had been found, but more importantly, the kingdom had found its way back to the compassionate governance that represented its highest ideals. The future stretched ahead with promise rather than uncertainty, guided by principles of service rather than privilege, connection rather than separation. In the end, the greatest discovery had been the simplest one. The true strength came not from the ability to command, but from the wisdom to care, and that the most important transformations often began with paying attention to the needs of those who had been forgotten by everyone else.